Welcome back to another episode of Diplomacy and Discourse. Today, I want to speak with you about two words that are so often repeated but rarely practiced with any real depth: diplomacy and discourse. These are not just political terms reserved for heads of states and ambassadors in faraway capitals. They are survival tools for societies, for communities, and for individuals who must learn to live with differences. And at this moment, as we reflect on the passing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, it becomes painfully clear that these tools are eroding right when we need them the most. No one should die because of their opinions. No one should be reduced to a headline on social media or a cause for celebration by those who disagree with them. There are things that I do agree with Charlie Kirk, and there are things that I don't see eye to eye with. In fact, I disagree with many things he said. But disagreement is not a crime, and difference is not an offense punishable by death, violence, or celebration when tragedy comes. He was a man who voiced his convictions, and in a democracy worth its name, we need people willing to voice their convictions, even if half the country rolls their eyes at them. That is part of the deal. That is part of freedom. But look around, and it's hard to avoid the sense that freedom of thought is being replaced with tribalism, partisanship, and vitriol. We live under a dual-party system in America that is meant to simplify governance, but has instead compressed the full spectrum of human complexity down to two shallow buckets: left and right, Republican or Democrat, conservative or progressive. But no single person's identity, beliefs, or conscience fits neatly into those two boxes. And yet, we are forced to act as if they do. The result is a society where vast portions of the population view each other not only as political opponents, but as existential threats. Our geography is divided. Many neighborhoods are politically homogenous, entire states lean decisively one way or the other, and fewer people encounter genuine opposition in their daily lives. Religion, rather than standing as a bridge between people of different politics, is too often harnessed as a fault line. Race, gender, sexuality, and language, all of them become battlefronts instead of enriching features of a diverse society. In this two-bucket world, our information becomes sorted by allegiance. The news you watch, the podcasts you hear, the social feeds you scroll on is often curated by invisible algorithms that prioritize outrage because outrage keeps you engaged. Over time, this doesn't simply give you a perspective. It encloses you in a reality. You and your neighbor can live on the same street, share the same weather, pay the same taxes, and yet inhabit fundamentally different worlds of facts. And once facts diverge, persuasion becomes nearly impossible. Discussion devolves into accusation, and accusation escalates into contempt. The mechanics of our politics deepen this sorting. Gerrymandered districts reduce competitive elections, rewarding the loudest and most ideological voices in primaries while punishing compromise. Media personalities and influencers discover that controversy converts attention into currency, and nuance is a poor business model. Even well-meaning leaders begin to speak in absolutes because absolutes win the day online. What gets lost is the quiet work of bridge building, the kind of unglamorous conversations that produce trust, which is the true infrastructure of democracy. When we speak about the risk of division, what we are really talking about is the potential for conflict not just on social media, but in the streets. Civil wars are are not born in a single day. They grow year after year in the soil of mistrust, anger, humiliation, and a refusal to engage with differences. And as you can see, the signs are all around us if you look closely. The contempt in people's voices when they describe the other side, the way friendships dissolve online, the way families fracture at the dinner table during election years. We have become addicted to the idea that one half of the country is the villain and the other half the savior. And we forget that villains and saviors rarely exist in the real world. What exists are human beings, complicated, flawed, sometimes wise, sometimes foolish. Human beings who need one another more than they want to admit. History offers warnings as well as remedies. Societies that drift into internal conflict share familiar patterns. Factional media ecosystems. Leaders who profit from division. A shrinking middle that grows exhausted and silent. And a normalization of political intimidation as a tool. But history also shows that de-escalation is possible through cross-cutting institutions, shared projects that transcend party, and rituals of civic life that remind people they belong to something larger than a faction. Town halls, community service, joint problem solving around local issues. These are not mere niceties. They are inoculations against violence. Another lesson is that pressure needs release valves. If grievances have nowhere to go but the internet, they ferment. Productive discourse gives those grievances form and direction. When people can speak and be heard, truly heard, the temperature drops. This is why rules of fair debate, the presence of trusted moderators, and the practice of steel-manning the opposing view are not academic exercises. They are techniques for keeping pluralism intact under strain. They transform confrontation into conversation. Finally, we have to recognize the role of what some call conflict entrepreneurs, actors who benefit from keeping us angry. Their incentives are not alignment, but adrenaline. The antidote is building alternative incentives into our civic and media life, rewarding leaders who build coalitions, elevating outlets that verify rather than inflame, and personally choosing to share content that illuminates more than it incites. Each micro-choice pushes culture either toward the brink or back from it. Overlay this division with something else: the silent epidemic of mental strain. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, addiction. These are not isolated problems. They are everywhere, and they touch every demographic. Some of this is fueled by the digital lives we live, scrolling through endless feeds of outrage, curated to make us angry or afraid. Some of it flows from economic insecurity, the feeling that jobs, wages, and futures are slipping further out of reach. And some of it comes from the weakening of the institutions that used to provide community, like churches, clubs, civic organizations, extended families. In that empty space, politics has taken root. When you don't know where else to find meaning, identity, and solidarity, politics start to do the work religion or family once did. The problem is that politics, by its very nature, is about competition and conflict. And when fragile minds and lonely hearts go looking for refuge in competition and conflict, despair deepens, anger sharpens, and division grows. We are also living through a profound crisis of attention. The average day is carved into 1,000 alerts, each demanding a response, each fragmenting our focus. Neuroscience tells us that constant context switching floods the brain with stress hormones, leaving us jumpy, irritable, and less capable of sustained thought, the very state in which propaganda thrives. Couple that with social comparisons that make us feel inadequate, and you have a recipe for chronic dissatisfaction. In that condition, the simplest narratives, blame them, hate them, feel like relief. Complexity begins to feel like a threat. There are practical countermeasures. Individuals can adopt digital Sabbaths, curate feeds that include credible voices from across the spectrum, and replace doom scrolling with deliberate reading and real conversation. Communities can expand access to mental health resources, create third spaces where people gather without a partisan purpose, and teach media literacy that emphasizes verification over virality. None of this eliminates conflict, but it increases our capacity to handle it without breaking. This is where the decline of diplomacy and discourse becomes so dangerous. Diplomacy is not just the language of foreign ministers negotiating over treaties. It is the language of neighbors who learn to coexist. This is the art of saying, I don't agree with you, but I will live alongside you anyway. It is the commitment to relationships in spite of disagreements. And discourse is more than debate. It is the refusal to walk away from the conversation, the insistence that dialogue must continue even when agreement seems impossible. Discourse is slow, it is hard, and it is messy. But democracy collapses without it. Because democracy is not built on victory, it is built on exchange. It rests on the understanding that the shared table is more important than the argument happening at it. And here is the painful irony. We need voices like Charlie Kirk, not because we must agree with everything he said, far from it, but because without voices from the right, the left cannot see its blind spots. Without liberal voices, conservatives cannot measure their own extremes. In the friction between perspectives, society finds balance. It is not harmony, but tension, that keeps things together. Imagine a tent with only one pole. It collapses. But stretch it between poles pulling in opposite directions, and suddenly the structure stands tall. That is what discourse provides. A framework held in tension, strong because of its disagreements, not in spite of them. We should also be honest that engaging across divides is emotionally taxing. It asks us to accept discomfort as the cost of citizenship. A useful practice is to begin with shared values rather than contested policies. Safety, dignity, opportunity, fairness. If we can agree on the destination, we can debate the route with less suspicion. Another practice is charitable interpretation, assuming the best version of an opponent's intent unless proven otherwise. It's not naive, it is strategic. Trust is the cheapest form of social glue. There are encouraging models to borrow from. Cross-partisan citizen assemblies, community mediation programs, and campus forums that require participants to articulate their opponent's view to their opponent's satisfaction before offering a rebuttal. These structures slow the conversation down so understanding can form before judgment hardens. They do not erase differences, but they make disagreement safer and therefore more sustainable. On a personal level, we can diversify our media diets the way a good doctor diversifies nutrition. Avoid all sugar outrage. Add sources that challenge you, and verify before you share. We can invite someone we disagree with to coffee and set ground rules. Question first, no interruptions, summarize before responding. And we can model a tone that refuses mockery, even when it would be easy. Because mockery is the gateway drug to dehumanization. That is why celebrating the death of someone with whom we disagreed is not only unkind, it is destructive. It teaches us to think of political adversaries not as fellow citizens, but as enemies unworthy of human dignity. And once you start down that path, it is not long before words become weapons, and weapons spill real blood. The silencing of voices through tragedy, or the celebration of that silencing, is the opposite of discourse. It is the opposite of democracy. So where are we left? We are left with a choice. We can continue to reduce ourselves to caricatures, turning every election into an existential deathmatch, every disagreement into a war of annihilation, or we can do something far harder. We can insist on practicing daily diplomacy. We can choose to pause before dehumanizing someone online. We can allow ourselves to hear voices we dislike without celebrating their misfortune. We can choose to protect the shared table, even when the conversation at that table drives us mad. Because the alternative is the collapse of conversation altogether. And when words no longer bind us, violence often takes their place. The death of Charlie Kirk is a moment not for gloating, but for reflection. To reflect on who we are becoming, and how far we have strayed from the promise of democracy. It is an opportunity to recommit ourselves, not to agreement, but to dialogue. Not to uniformity, but to coexistence. Because the health of a democracy has never been measured by the sameness of its voices, but by its ability to hold together voices profoundly different. That is the work of discourse. That is the work of democracy, and it is the work we cannot abandon. Thank you for sharing this time with me today on the Diplomacy and Discourse podcast. Until next time, let's commit to keeping diplomacy alive, keeping discourse alive, and most of all, keeping our humanity alive. Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk.